Welcome to Season 2 of Nuances Beyond First Impressions with the Asian Diaspora. Together, we wanted to create a safe space where everyone can learn more about our diverse communities, the complicated relationships we have with our culture, and how they intersect with feminism, queerness, disability, anti-racism, career choices, politics, and more.
I'm Ari and Mila, a Filipino-American from a small town on the southern border of Texas.
And I'm Charlene Lee, aka Lazu, a new American originally from the only place a dodo bird ever lived, Mauritius. If you are new to the show, our format includes definitions of terms that may be unfamiliar, our guest interview, and finally our takeaways. You can find these definitions and takeaways in the show notes as well as on our website. We only have one term for you today, and that is body shaming, which is criticizing or mocking someone for supposed bodily faults or imperfections, such as their height, their weight, facial features, skin, hair texture, tattoos, etc. Now on to our conversation with Charlene Vela.
Today we have Charlene Vela. Charlene is a Filipino-American. She was born in Switzerland and moved to the States with her parents and younger brother when she was 4 years old, living most of her life in Texas. During the day, she works at a tech company in Austin, and in her free time, she loves being part of the local dance community and playing board games with her friends and husband. Charlene and I actually know each other through dance. We danced at the same studio, so it's great to have you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So to start, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, how you have navigated the dance world, the tech industry, your experiences being AAPI?
Yeah. I'll start with dance. I grew up in ballet. We grew up in a town of 4,000 or 5,000 people, so a super small town. But my mom managed to find the one ballet studio in the Tri-County area and then put me in it. So I danced ballet for about 11 years up until I was about 15. So that was the only style of dance I ever took. And then it wasn't until after college that I really explored other styles like contemporary, jazz, and even hip hop. I didn't really think about it until recently, how surrounded I was by mostly white people. So not only did I grow up in a town of mostly white people, but being in the dance world, there is still a certain aesthetic in ballet. I've always been curvy. It's something I'm still learning to love about myself and strive to be healthy. But I spent a lot of time around these tiny girls, these beautiful girls, and some of them were my best friends. None of them were ever body shaming, but after a while, you notice you're a little bit different, not just from your size, but also like, oh, I'm the only person that is not white in this space. And again, it never felt like an other situation, but it wasn't until later that I realized I was a different person. But I feel like I was very lucky that I didn't feel that way growing up.
I can definitely relate to being a little bigger than the other ballet dancers. I did Chinese ballet. I always felt like I was the thickest person there. And nobody ever shamed me for it, but I was always put in the back when there were performances. There were little things. My friends didn't make me feel it, but the teacher definitely did.
Yeah. For me, it wasn't the teacher. It wasn't the girls because all of them were my best friends. It was the costumes. A lot of them, I'd buy what is considered a large in dance apparel, and it was tight on me. Around recital time is, okay, do I need to go on a diet so I don't break out of this leotard when I'm just a little bit bigger than the average dancer at the time. But the nice thing is now that I've explored a lot of other styles, I would say most other styles are far more diverse just in the kind of people that are there, the size of people, which is great. And not to say that ballet isn't there yet, but it's not. And I think it's just one of those things that everyone's learning still. But I'm glad to have found other communities that are also just as accepting.
I know a lot of people who their biggest thing in ballet that turned them away from ballet was the body image. I feel like eating disorders are almost implicitly encouraged in ballet. If you're starving, nobody says, oh, are you okay? Are you healthy? It's, oh, great job.
I think I was shielded from a lot of that. I never saw friends do that. I don't know if I was just around girls who just stay petite. That's just how it is sometimes. After a while, even if it's not implied in the environment, you notice when you're a little bit different. And it makes me a little bit self-conscious about it because it happens when you're so young. It's still something that I struggle with. Even being in a more diverse dance community with different shapes, sizes, and colors, you still compare yourself to what you remember as the standard figure as a dancer. When you're young, this is the world. This is all I know. And then you don't realize it till later. When was it that Misty Copeland became the first African-American principal ballerina? 2015? Last 10 years for sure. Because it was such a big deal.
Yeah. You had mentioned you noticed that you were the only non-white person in your dance classes. Was it the same in school? And when did you realize that you were the non-white person or that you were different? different, and how did it affect you?
It's a funny question because I was thinking about growing up, and I think it took a lot longer than maybe other people have experienced. I think I was very lucky. I grew up in a town, I think it was 4,000 people at the time. It was a majority white people, 80%, and I think the next largest percentage was Hispanics or Latinos. The funny part, which is my fun fact, when you look up my town in Wikipedia, there's a demographic breakdown. So it's ex-white, something Hispanics, and then there's a demographic for Asian Pacific Islander. And when you do the math compared to percentage times the population, it actually worked out to be my family. It was 4.5 people or something like that. I was like, okay, cool. We're represented. That's great. It's just us. Fantastic. And I think because the next largest demographic was Mexican, a lot of people thought I was Mexican. I'm brown. I'm definitely a tanner Asian, if you want to call it that. And then also my last name, Vela, it means candle in Spanish. But I think I was very lucky. I very rarely felt out of place or othered specifically. I wasn't othered because I wasn't white. The circle of friends I had growing up, I knew basically since we were in the States. I got put in a private kindergarten when I was 4, and the kids that I went to school with, because the town is so small, we don't go to like different elementary schools. We go to the elementary school in town. So we just stayed friends throughout grade school. I also already knew English because I was born in Switzerland. My mom got a job there. So I actually came to the States not knowing Tagalog. I knew English and German. So I had, if anything, a German accent as much as a 4-year-old can. I was definitely always at the top of my class, and teachers took note of me. So I almost established myself to where I wasn't the weird fob. Because I didn't come from the Philippines, I wasn't othered that way. I think the racism that I experienced was mostly just ignorance. And I think that's obviously a big part of racism. But I remember in middle school, someone brought up my race. And they were like, oh, you're not Mexican? I said, no, I'm Asian. And they're like, so you're Chinese? No. Because when you're not exposed to other cultures, you're just like, China is the Asian country. In 7th grade is when we got another Asian, which sounds so weird to say out loud, but it's true. There was a kid that came from Korea. He came to school and they were like, another Asian. And I remember this girl, not very bright, obviously, turned to me and they're like, can you guys understand each other? I'm like, oh, no. I barely understand Tagalog and he speaks Korean. And they're like, so, I'm like, so no, is the short answer. So just little things like that. And I don't think I realized it until, frankly, left for college and left for a different school that I'm like, oh, that's not normal. I think the only really blatant racism that I experienced was I noticed another school was having International Day, and our school does not do that because we'd have 2 booths, some European countries and then Mexico or something. And there was one kid wearing a Mexican flag shirt, and one girl was like, I can't believe she's wearing that. And I was like, why? Because this is America. I don't remember if that's exactly what she said, but it was like that kind of intention. And I remember saying, so would you be mad if I wore a shirt with a Filipino flag on it? And she said, yeah. I was like, got it. And I think I just had to move on because I don't understand why this would be a thing. And then I went to another school. My last 2 years of high school was in Denton. And it was just nice to be around far more cultures. I realized some of the things I grew up with were common in the Asian culture, but I didn't realize it because I had no one else to really talk to about it. I didn't realize what I was experiencing was a shared experience, literally because there was no one else to talk to about it. I was like, oh, that's not good what happened to me. And I just never talked about it with my family because it never pained me enough to bring it up to someone.
When I was elementary, junior high, it was mostly Latino. And people always think my dad is Mexican too. And so I didn't really encounter racism, but I did get questions that were ignorant. Like they would ask me if I knew Chinese or if I was Chinese or what their name was in Chinese or in Tagalog. And I'm like, it's the same name. We literally have the same last name. We share a colonizer. But then I get to high school and there were other Asians and other Filipinos too and other cultures. And that's when it clicked. Oh my God, we have these shared experiences. We can make Asian jokes. I had a safe space where I didn't know that my experiences were as common.
When I went to college, I don't know why, but most of my friends were still white. And I don't know if that's just the organizations I chose to join. I didn't join a specific Filipino group or a Filipino sorority or anything. And I almost felt like, I don't know if I would fit in. Am I Filipino enough? I remember thinking, that doesn't make sense for me to join. I'm going to stick out like a sore thumb. And I don't even know. I'd never went to an informational meeting or anything like that. And I think that was just because of my my proximity to mostly white people most of my life, it just wasn't on my radar that I should join a Filipino organization.
How do you feel as far as feeling Filipino enough or feeling American enough?
I would say most of my Filipino raising and proximity to Filipinos was Filipino parties. So I'm sure you've been to some of them too, where you're like, it's just rotating houses. Sometimes it's at Tita Mirna's, and it's just what feels like hundreds of Filipinos. I don't even know if that's true, but as a kid, you're like, literally every Filipino on earth is in this house right now. A lot of mine was those kind of parties. Karaoke, lumpia, pancit, that kind of stuff at every single party. And then there's the kids' room that every kid just goes to, and that's where we mingle. Because I didn't have Filipinos in my hometown or any other Asians, that was my cultural upbringing. And I think it almost solidified that proximity to whiteness because my cousins grew up in a mostly white environment too. All of those kids were first generation American. We kind of all bonded in a way. We're the child of immigrants. Technically, I'm an immigrant too because I wasn't born here. But yeah, a lot of my Filipino-ness comes from those parties. And I don't think I really appreciated it until later. I was born in Switzerland and I came to the States when I was 4. But unlike where if you're born in the States, you're automatically a U.S. citizen, that's not like that in Switzerland. So I didn't have a Swiss passport. I had a Filipino passport until I was 19, and then we became naturalized. So I had a Philippine passport for 15 years, even though we were living in the States and I was born in Switzerland. So I almost feel like a twice removed immigrant because I wasn't born in my mother country. I wasn't a first generation American. I knew Swiss, German, and English. So it's a funny citizenship story because if I was deported, I'd go back to a country that I've never been to. And so that was weird to think about. But I do feel very American. I'll say that. I think sometimes I'll think about whether or not I am Asian enough or Filipino enough because now as I'm getting older, there's a want to potentially pass that down to our kids. Like, what does that look like? I don't know Tagalog. Can I learn to make lumpia? Yeah, I can do that. So I definitely feel American enough. Now I'm like, okay, I'm in a safe space to try to figure out my heritage. And I think the rise of Facebook and subtle Filipino traits and subtle Asian traits, it's a random part, but it's a huge part where it's, oh, I experienced that too. Oh, we do that. Is that an Asian thing? Okay, neat. That's me. So it's been nice to share those experiences and see other people who are immigrants or don't feel Asian enough. And so I feel very much American enough, regardless of what other people might think about that. It's more just now, how do I make sure that I feel Filipino enough?
I haven't been back to the Philippines since 97. I've been to Asia. I have been to Taiwan, and it's weird because I go there expecting to feel like everyone here sort of looks like me. I don't look that East Asian, but I look more similar here. And so I go in expecting to feel like, okay, I'm going to be with people that might get me more. But then I get there and I don't feel like I fit in. And I think they see me as American and they go up and they talk to me in Mandarin. I've spoken in Tagalog at airports and stuff, and they're like, you're American. And I'm like, yeah, I have an accent. And I do feel a sense of belonging when I meet other Asian Americans and we can talk about our experiences. But in the US, when I'm around white people, there's always a sense that there's things that they don't understand about my experience. And then when I go to Asia, it's the same thing.
It's a funny experience too. Your story made me think of when I first went to the Philippines. I haven't been either since 2003. Because I didn't speak Tagalog, I was told not to talk pretty much the entire time. My parents and everyone that I was traveling with was like, try not to talk to anyone because they will know you're from America and they will assume we have money. So I look like them, but I'm not going to sound like them, so I have to not talk, which was a weird thing to experience. And it was fine when we got to our aunt's and uncle's house, but in the airport or in the taxi, it was, don't say anything, just salamat po, that's it, that's all you need to know, and just move on. It was weird thinking I fit in better in the States than I do in my mother country, but at the same time, like, it's weird saying mother country too, because never spent any time there, other than the 2 weeks I was there in 2003. I married a white guy, and one of my favorite things of our dating process was him meeting my family. And part of that is Filipino parties. And so it was really fun to talk about, oh, here's the different foods you should try. Here's the cultural things that you should keep in mind. I'm going to bless them, which is manopo. When you greet an older person, you put their hand to your forehead, and it's just a sign of respect. It's a blessing. So Tyler knows to do that with everyone. And so I've now been able to show my culture, and he's so open to it. He loves Filipino food, obviously. It's been a nice way to share my culture, and it's almost reaffirming, I know my culture. I know my culture enough to share it with the person I'm spending the rest of my life with. That's a random thing that has made me feel more Filipino in a weird way, to be able to share that with him.
It's funny you mentioning going to Asia and feeling like you don't fit in. I grew up where most people are either Black or of Indian descent, and Chinese people who look like me were about 2% of the population. So I was a minority to them. But when I go to Asia, I stick out. And also, I can't find any clothes that fit me. I don't know if it's the same in the Philippines, but I've been to Singapore, Malaysia, Taiwan, and Thailand, and I wear XXXL. And as a teenager, you already have a lot to be self-conscious about. And then you go there and you're like, I'm super fat.
And fat shaming is a thing over there. I remember I didn't necessarily feel fat going there, but I guess because everyone else is very petite and triple XL is a size 4 here or something. You know?
I know, it was crazy.
Yeah. And even family members make fun. I think that every Asian experiences that, which is terrible, but everyone is, oh, did you gain weight? or oh, you lost weight. Good. It's never, are you okay? It's good.
Yeah, so I definitely felt like I don't fit in whenever I go to Asia. And then growing up, there weren't a lot of East Asians. It was mostly just Chinese. But it was not the same as Chinese. I've never been to China. I don't speak the language. I eat all the food. That's about it. When I went to university, I did not feel comfortable joining the Chinese group.
Yeah.
There was a Mauritian club, though, so I did join that one.
That's awesome. It's funny you say that because most of my friends are white. Of my best friends, only one of them is Asian. And it's funny, we've talked about where we have a similar experience where we've grown up around mostly white people. Most of our friends are still white. We don't necessarily partake in, I don't know, I say Asian activities like that's a thing. And so we've bonded over being able to say, hey, we grew up in a similar situation. And it's nice that we're both Asian because then we can say, oh, here's the subtle things about our Asian culture that we've both experienced, but also have mostly lived in this white world. Yeah. So it's each other's comfort blankets. So it's nice.
Yeah, it's been an interesting transition for me because I went from living in a place where everybody was dark-skinned and I was the minority. And then I come here where supposedly the majority is white and I'm the minority. And I'm still adapting to that reality. Every now and then I'll have this moment of, oh yeah, white people are the majority here.
Yeah. That's so funny that white people being the majority is weird for you because anyone I talk to, that's the reality that everyone has experienced.
Yeah, because we had less than 1% white people there. I think it's changing now because a bunch of expats have figured out that life is good there and they all moved. I now live in an area that is predominantly white. And it feels very strange. I only saw white people on screen before. Yeah. So when I see white people, I think movies.
Yeah. Oh, that's so funny. And when did you move to the States?
I moved to Canada first in 2007, and then I moved to the States in 2013.
Okay.
I moved to Toronto, and Toronto is a huge melting pot. There were more Asian people there than white people, I think. So I did not feel that at all there, but definitely moving to America, I felt it a lot more. And my first stop was Silicon Valley, which is very diverse for America, but it still felt like, ooh, a lot of white people.
You saw more than 2, so you're like, oh, there's another one.
But yeah, it's been an adjustment.
That's so funny. Even now, 9 years later?
Yeah, sometimes I catch myself being surprised by things. One Sunday, we were taking our bikes and we knew there was this little strip mall down the street. So let's go check out the strip mall, see what's there. And we get there and the parking lot is full and it turns out that there is this big church there that is one of those churches that didn't close during the pandemic and thinks that God will prevent you from getting COVID. There's a bunch of trucks there that have the not so American flag flying. And there's 2 masses that day. People are waiting for the other mass to finish so that they can get to their mass and they're all like hanging out and no mask at all. And it was kind of scary. I pedaled back home as fast as I could. I hope they didn't notice that I was here and that I was Asian.
Yeah.
Right, bye.
You're like, I'm going to go. Thank you.
It does kind of hit me in the face every now and then. I'm like, ooh.
I feel like I didn't notice it as much pre-2016. Yes, I'm Asian, but I feel pretty assimilated. But then post-2016, I think I started to be cognizant of the fact that I would probably be othered by certain people. And I used to think that, oh, yeah, there'll be racists, but they're a minority. But then post-2016, I was like, wait, not quite. There's more of them than I thought. And there's people who won't stick up if someone says something to me that's offensive. I used to think, oh, there's good people out there, they'll say something. But now I'm like, I don't actually know that.
And I was thinking too about when the pandemic broke out. And I was so shocked to hear about the racism that occurred thinking it was a Chinese virus. I felt so guilty, but even though I am Asian, I almost felt this weird comfort that I don't look East Asian. I could be Mexican. Don't attack me, you know. I think I live in a relatively safe bubble where I've always surrounded myself with non-ignorant people, but it was also just a random comfort. And also for my parents, frankly. They still live in that very white town. People look at us and they'd probably tag them as Mexican. And so there's a weird safety that I felt when I was hearing more about the racism around COVID, which is terrible to think about, that I'm like, okay, we're just going to lean into the brownness and hope that nothing happens. I make light of it, but when I felt it, I felt safe and then I felt awful. That was even something that I had to think about.
Yeah, and I've definitely felt the white majority thing when I went to Nashville after 2016. The first time I went, it was before, and I had a great time. But then after, I felt very self-conscious about, okay, I gotta watch who's around me. And I did notice that, first of all, I was usually the only Asian around in Nashville, almost wherever we went. And I did notice that in some areas, some bars that we went to, I would get looks from people. They would look at me like they'd never seen an Asian person before. And I'm like, I'm sure you've seen other Asians. I did feel a little out of place. And I had considered moving to Nashville before, but then after 2016, I was like, LA. But LA has much better food, so no regrets there.
There's more Asian food.
Yeah.
I've realized I can't live without good Asian food and good Mexican food. In Austin, there's decent Mexican restaurants, but it's not like back home. But then back home, there's not a ton of Asian restaurants. I have to split my time between Austin and the Valley.
My town didn't have an Asian restaurant until 2005, I think. It was a while.
Well, you were the only Asians and you didn't have a restaurant. So.
Yeah, exactly. But we've been open a Chinese restaurant just to throw everybody off. Oh, man.
I wish there were more Filipino. I don't know if you know of any good ones around here, but the one I did like, which was Be More Pacific, they closed during the pandemic.
It's so funny. So I brought my parents there and they definitely said it was a watered down version of Filipino food. And I agree with that. All right, you changed this a little bit because of your demographic. There is one in Round Rock called Little Mama's. It's a very hole in the wall and that's pretty good. My parents love that place when they come here. So that's a good one. It's still new. I feel like Filipino food is still making its way into mainstream Asian foods.
I'm starting to see more ube flavored things.
That's a safe one. Lumpia, ube things, and everyone loves noodles, so we could share pancit with the world, I think. I think all of it's delicious, but I think it's making its way. There's a Hulu documentary, I forgot what it was called. Anyway, it means dish in Tagalog. It does talk about how Filipino food workers, chefs, etc., a lot of times they didn't work in restaurants that serve Filipino food because they didn't exist and they have to learn how to run a restaurant business before opening their own. So it's a cool documentary talking about while they're in the kitchen introducing these chefs to Filipino food and they're like, this is delicious. Yes. Put it on the menu.
Yeah, I mean, I'm biased, but I do think people are sleeping on our food, so I'm glad to see it making its way.
Yeah, I don't know why there aren't that many Filipino restaurants, because when I was in Toronto, I tried everything that I could find there, and there were no Filipino restaurants, now that I think about it, because if there was, I would have tried it. I tried all the Vietnamese food, and the Korean food, and Japanese food, and Ethiopian food, but I didn't see any Filipino restaurant. There was even a Mauritian restaurant. Believe it or not. It only opened 2 days a week, but it existed.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm sure there's stories behind that. When you're talking about cultural expectations, is it just not a thing for Filipinos to try to go into the restaurant business? Or do we just take a back seat when we do that it's, we're just going to learn to make this food instead of trying to push our own?
I feel like anytime my family and I would go to restaurants.
Do you say family? Is what just happened? Okay.
Yeah, I can't do a great Tita Baby accent. But my dad, his family, that's their thing. So there's this expectation that I gotta cook as well as my dad and my aunt. So whenever we go to restaurants, especially Filipino restaurants, he would be like, oh, I can make this at home, which is true. My dad makes better kare-kare than what I've had at restaurants. So I feel like we would have to support these Filipino-owned restaurants, even if we think our family makes it better. I think that's the reason why, for my family, we never really looked for Filipino restaurants because we can make it better here.
Right. And it's funny, in the documentary, they do talk about that. They do talk about how part of the Filipino food barrier is that you're like, oh, my tita makes it so much better. Even within our Filipino parties, there is the person that makes the sinigang. There's the person that makes the adobo. So throughout the years, we're like, all right, Auntie Mirna makes the sinigang the best, so she's going to make that for Christmas. And Mimi makes the best dinuguan, so she's going to make that. So it's very much like we have all settled into what we know as the best, and there's no reason to get it elsewhere because we can make it at home.
Is there a family competition going on that people really want to be the ones chosen to make the dish?
That's what it should be, a Filipino cook-off, who makes the best lumpia or something. And then everyone would come to that because everyone loves egg rolls. So yeah, that'd be fun, actually.
I could imagine it getting pretty wild.
Intense.
Because sometimes at parties, the titas would be like, oh, I cooked that, try it. And I would have to eat it in front of
You're like, is it good?
Is it better than the other one?
Yeah.
I know you're having those conversations about gender equality and feminism. As far as being within the AAPI community, how has it felt navigating that movement? And do you feel like it's gotten intersectional enough? What kinds of conversations do you wish were happening?
One thing I love about my family is I think they taught me feminism before I even knew what that word was, and even before it was a hot topic again for our generation. When we moved to the States, my mom was the one that worked. She was the one that got the work visa. When we got here, my parents didn't want to put me in a daycare. And so my dad was the one that stayed home with me and my brother up until I was 14. So for 10 years, he was at home and taking care of us. Yes, the concept of a stay-at-home mom was a thing, and I think I knew that. But to me, it was a stay-at-home parent. So there was never this role of like mom staying home when the kids are still at home or not in school. And when we're talking about gender roles, my parents really pushed me into the STEM field. They knew I was good at math. They knew I was good at science. They also made sure I was that way. And I think because my dad is and was an engineer at the time, he was the one who would check my math homework. He would check all my homework, but his strength was math and science. So I got good at it because that was his focus. And same with my brother. With my parents, it's not like we were breaking the mold by getting me into an engineering degree. I graduated with a statistics degree. It wasn't anything where I felt like I was breaking a glass ceiling. It was just, you're going to go into the STEM field. And I think it's a different conversation too, but it's a secure field. I've been listening to the other podcast episodes on here, and I'm not a producer. I'm not a musician. I still stuck with a very secure field. I'm not a doctor or in the medical field. I could never do that. But I'm not a nurse as a Filipino woman. Most of the other women in my family are still in the medical field. And I do think that's part of my upbringing as an Asian. Pick something that's secure. For a hot second, I thought maybe I can pursue dance. And then I just converted back to no, I could never do that. I couldn't just leave my job and have no plan. That's not something that was specifically discouraged, but secure is where you need to be. But on the topic of feminism, I think I was very lucky that my parents didn't say, oh, you're a girl, you can't do this. They normalized, you're going to go into engineering. I would win math competitions. I was a mathlete. It's cool. And those are the two things I can think about where gender roles tend to play a role as you're growing up, is what subjects are you good at? And I think they didn't mean to do anything different intentionally, but because that's how I grew up, that's how I've always seen myself. And that's very lucky that me and my partner are the same way, that there's no gender roles. I'm very independent. I'm going to do what I want. I don't need your permission. And it's not even something where I'm actively fighting against it. It's just, this is how it is. We're equals, like people are. But I know that's not the case for other people. I've definitely seen where, oh, I don't handle that. That's the husband's job. And I'm like, is it? It's definitely a choice. It's always a choice. And I think that's definitely what feminism is all about, is whether that's your role or not, as long as it's what you want to do, as long as you are giving your partner a choice, that's really what feminism is to me. And I think is for most people, I would hope.
So funny that you say that when your family immigrated here, your dad stayed home and your mom worked, because that's how it was with my family too.
Really? That's great.
For less time, because my dad started working when I started kindergarten. But for the first 5 years, my dad stayed home. My mom worked because she's the one that had the employment visa because she got a teaching job. So my dad hadn't gotten a job yet. So he was the one who stayed home with me. He did little flashcards so that I would learn how to read.
Me too. I would sit on a chair and my dad would hold up math flat, like 7 times 6, 42, 5 times whatever. That's funny that you had that too.
Yeah. And it's funny because English is not my dad's first language, but that's the language he taught me first. That's so crazy that the flashcards, that's also a shared experience.
It's really cool that no gender roles were assigned in your early life. And so you were able to just explore things without knowing the expectations. Because I also had somewhat similar experience where I actually went to all-girls school throughout high school. I never had boys in my class. So I never had any concept of boys were supposed to be better at certain things. I did take some extra classes on top of school because that was a thing back then. So there were boys there, but being in an all-girls school and in a school where they were the top girls in the country, we were ranked when we were 12 years old, which was an insane system. But I got into the best school. Everyone around me was a nerd. So first of all, I was not picked on for being a nerd because everybody else was a nerd. And then also, we were all doing different things. Some of us were in literature, some of us were in science. And so I had the freedom to just like what I like and not question it. And then it's only after I went to college that I started hearing all those stereotypes, like computer science is for boys or whatever. It wasn't at my school. We were all girls.
Yeah. And it's funny, I think, because like you said, we grew up with that being normal. And I think that's not the case for a lot of people. That when you hear, oh yeah, the wife stays at home, that's her role. You're like, what are you talking about? There was no role here. If anything, for me, our dad stayed home. That was the role.
And I actually didn't even notice that there were all these stereotypes until I think I was about to graduate, and we did a workshop with a communications teacher, and she had gathered a bunch of women who had graduated from the computer science program or who were going to graduate. Some of the people who had already graduated were talking about their experience working in the field and all the sexism they faced and just all those little microaggressions. At that moment, I realized that I had experienced those too. I just hadn't noticed what they were. I just didn't really think much of it. And retrospectively, I'm like, oh, that was sexist.
Yeah. And it's funny you say that because I do think sometimes when I say I didn't experience a lot of racism, part of me is maybe I just didn't notice. And I think maybe as a woman too, as a person of color, as an Asian, at least for me, when I don't get a job interview or when I get passed up for something, I'm like, oh, I wasn't good enough. It's on me. But I think I probably have experienced more than I think I have. And I just don't realize it because I assume that I did something, quote, wrong.
I feel the same way when I look back on certain experiences where teachers would treat me weirdly, or I've had experiences with old managers who would point out the most random, insignificant things. The stuff I had on my desk, like that kind of, what I've noticed is the goalposts keep changing. You think, okay, let me just prove myself to this person. Let me prove myself to white people. I'll show them that I'm competent. But I don't think we'll ever get to a place where they think we're good enough because it's always going to be, oh, now you need to do this. Now you need to do this. And for me, I think maybe there were moments where I didn't realize that it was subconscious racism.
What you just said just sparked a memory that I forgot I had. We were at an awards ceremony. I won a competition and our parents were there. And I think they were announcing our parents' names to come up and present the award to each kid. And they were like, Charlene Vela and her parents. And this teacher has known me forever. And she said something along the lines of, I'm not even going to try to pronounce your parents' names. Okay, it's not that hard. Sound it out. It's one of those things you look back on, you're like, that was weird and a little bit racist that you don't think about it at the time. And also too, you're just sparking so many memories now. I remember being so offended that my friend said something like, sometimes I can't understand your dad because he has an accent. I just felt so ashamed of it. And I got mad at my friend. Now looking back, I'm like, yeah, sometimes accents are hard to understand and that's totally understandable. But I just remember being so ashamed about it. Oh, my parents have an accent. Something's wrong with them. And now I'm like, no, it's because they speak 7 languages. Of course they have an accent. One of them happens to be English. Yeah, just little things that I didn't think about being racist at the time. It was more just, oh, we are less than for some reason. Yeah, so I've never gotten funny looks that I know of. I've never been specifically told, oh, you're too dark for the part or something like that. But it doesn't mean it didn't happen. And I think that's maybe sometimes weird to think about. Sometimes I struggle with calling myself a person of color because I don't feel like I've been marginalized as much as other persons of color. And so when I say that I am, I just feel like I'm using that word that doesn't really apply to me because I don't feel like I have been discriminated against. But now looking back, maybe I was and I didn't know it. And also being a person of color is literally just who I am by definition. It's just little things that you don't realize growing up and people don't talk about it enough. Now looking back, that was an experience I had that I didn't realize until someone else pointed it out. Yeah, I experienced, oh, that is racist.
I have actually struggled with that too. I think I've struggled with, when I talk about our indigeneity as Filipinos, realizing my privilege as a light-skinned Filipino, I do struggle with talking about rediscovering my indigenous roots. I feel like Elizabeth Warren. But then that's literally who I am, though I'm Filipino by definition. But I understand that feeling of, have I been marginalized enough for me to claim this and for me to talk openly about this? But I do think that my perception might be different from what's actually happened or the way people view me. But even things like feeling ashamed of your parents' accents, I totally feel that because my dad, when he first started teaching, kids would snicker and laugh because of his accent. And I actually had experiences where I would be talking to my white friends and I would pronounce a word I learned English from my parents, so they had an accent. I sometimes learned to pronounce words the way they pronounced it, which apparently is incorrect. And so then I would be corrected and I would feel like, oh my God. It's interesting how when people point out the ways that we're different because of our background, we think of it as character defects rather than we just have a different cultural background. So it's crazy how when I would try to fit in, it was trying to push myself as close to being Caucasian as possible. Can I sound Caucasian on the phone and get rid of my accent? It's so crazy that that was the standard that we set for ourselves.
And it's funny because I didn't speak Tagalog moving to the States. I spoke German. Apparently, when I got here, I remember my mom saying, like, hey, we're going to continue to speak German, so you at least have another language. And I refused. So I don't know German that well either anymore. I think it's still up here a little bit. When I took German in college, I learned it a little bit faster than other kids. I think you mentioned somewhere where it's like a survival mechanism, but you don't even realize that it is a lot of times. You're just trying to cope and you're like, okay, these are what the kids are doing, so I will do that. And I don't think you're even consciously doing it. You're just trying to assimilate into the environment that you're in, which is not uncommon. Yes, there's Filipino parties, but if 95% of your time is around these white kids, then I'm going to try to be like the white kids. Again, not even consciously, just like I am now speaking like this. So that's how I sound now.
I think that there's internalized racism in the Asian community and in the Filipino community too. The number of times that people would say, mestizo ikaw, mukha kang mestizo, as though that's a compliment, which is so weird. I remember one year my family and I moved to Connecticut to be with the rest of my dad's family, and I came back home. I came back to the Valley, and I had started to sound a bit whiter because I was in the Northeast, a super white community. And people at the Filipino party that we were at were like, oh my God, she talks so nicely now. But what's nice about it? Why is it nicer than the way I used to speak or the way someone from here speaks? And then the whole thing with like the skin lightening products and all of that, it's a lot.
Yeah. It's funny. I think one thing I had going for me is that most of my white friends were trying to be tan. And I was like, natural. Sorry. They were like, you've got such a nice tan. Yes, I do. Thank you. I'm glad you noticed.
You were talking about subconscious racism. I think everybody has that, no matter what your race is, and even ourselves. I was telling my mom about our podcast and about how sometimes kids are told, oh, you got good grades because you're Asian. And she was like, but that's a compliment.
Yeah. Still racist.
And I was trying to explain to her, yeah, it seems nice in the moment, but then you submit your resume and then you don't get the job because the white kid had to work harder to get the same grade as you. There's just so much of it that we have internalized, and it's not just white people, it's every people. Sometimes I struggle with how much can we expect people to understand? Because as humans, we have limitations on how much our brain can process and retain. So I often struggle with, do I have unreasonable expectations of people to understand me? Because I always felt, okay, I'm this Asian looking person who grew up in Africa, doesn't speak any Asian language, speaks French. I'm a weirdo and I don't expect people to understand me. But the more I've talked to people on this podcast and outside, most people are like me, like you. You were born in Switzerland, you speak German and Filipino. So I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. What is reasonable to expect?
And it doesn't help either that there tends to be a lot of gatekeeping even within the Asian community or even within the Filipino community. I remember someone noticed me in at Dance Austin one time, and they were getting ready for a fashion show. And they asked me to join because they were doing some kind of luau. But one of them was Filipino. And they started speaking to me in Tagalog, and I was like, I'm so sorry, I don't understand that much. And they're like, oh, so you're not really Filipino. That was like 7 years ago, and I still think about it. At the end of the day, and this is true for anything, everyone is on their own journey around their own culturalism, if that's even a word. No one has the experience I do, frankly, that I know of, except for my brother. We're definitely Asian enough. We're definitely Filipino enough. And I think having more diversity around what kind of experiences Filipinos have had just makes our culture that much more interesting. And that's true for any community, any minority. There's so much gatekeeping that I've had to sometimes unfollow those Facebook groups where it's like, oh, you weren't born there? Oh, you don't know the language? Then you're not part of this group. No, I am. And you just have to tell yourself that and almost convince yourself that you are. But it's true.
I guess it's probably a reaction to having been shunned for being that. Now they're like, no, we're that and you're not. Trying to take control of that pride. But yeah, that sucks.
That makes sense. And I feel like it's almost an overcompensation in the other direction. I would have family say, oh, it's good that you can speak Tagalog, which I do agree. It's helpful to be connected in that way, but I think they made it sound like you're too whitewashed or you've lost your culture if you can't speak Tagalog, which is not true. And people have different reasons for speaking or not speaking whatever languages. So that took a while for me to unlearn and be comfortable with saying I'm just as Filipino as somebody else.
And I think people forget that because we all have our own experiences, they don't realize, even like we talked about earlier, the survival coping mechanisms that we aren't even consciously doing. We're going to speak English because that's what the other kids are doing. You're not even conscious of doing that you don't learn Tagalog or you don't learn your mother tongue. And then it's not till later that you feel safe exploring that side of you that it's now, quote, too late in some people's eyes. No, I'm ready to explore this. Every year I'm like, I'm going to learn Tagalog. I'm going to be super fluent. And then I drop off. But it never stops, I think, regardless of whether you've grown up in the Philippines or anywhere else.
Anybody who's grown up in a Western country, regardless of their ethnic background, there is some unlearning and internalized racism that we have to go through ourselves. Nobody's perfect. And even just the concept of broken English and speaking English correctly and all of that, that was something I had to unlearn. Somebody speaking English, quote unquote, incorrectly. What is correct anyway? Language evolves. So I think in conversations about race, people can get defensive and say, well, I'm not racist, but we're not attacking the person. It's just that everybody has to unlearn a little bit just because we grew up in a society that values whiteness.
That's so true. And I think there's patience that has to be had on both sides. Even with yourself, we all learn things a different way, and you have to accept where you are and unlearn and learn new things. And same with the other people. And I have to stop myself sometimes when I do hear people who have an accent when they're trying to speak English. There's almost like, they aren't as educated when they have an accent. And it's, no, they are translating something in their brain to English to try to talk to you who doesn't speak this other language. So that's something that I have to catch myself on, even still, that they're doing way more work than you are by listening to their English. They are translating something in their heads. I think it's constant learning all around and unlearning, like you said.
Yeah. We'll end this interview with 5 rapid fire questions. You don't have to think too hard about it. Ready?
Yes. This is, okay, hold on, pause. This is like the other, am I Asian enough? When you've said, what's your favorite Asian fruit? I'm like, do I have a favorite Asian fruit? Am I not Asian enough? Anyway, let's go. That's just another example of, it's fine. They're just fun questions. Okay.
Number 1. What was the first language you learned?
English and German.
What language do you speak with your parents?
English.
What's the most annoying question non-Asian people have asked you?
What are you?
Oh, you got that one too?
What? What are you asking me?
What's the most annoying stereotype you had to deal with?
Being smart.
What's an Asian food you should like but don't?
Peanut bet. So bad. I don't like it. I love most Filipino foods. It's just not a thing for me.
What is it?
It's a Filipino stew. It's very popular to me. It just tastes very bitter. My mom loves it. And I'm like, please don't make it for me. Like, come on.
We all have some of those. Lastly, what's an Asian food that you'll never get tired of?
Anything ube. Ube cakes, rolls. Anything from Goldilocks with ube in it.
Okay. Sound very ignorant here, but what is ube?
It's a purple root vegetable. It's funny, we actually looked up what's the difference between taro and ube, and they're very similar, and they're both purple. So it's a purple potato, basically. It's a purple sweet potato.
Yeah, because I've had taro, so it's similar to that.
Yeah, it's similar. I feel like ube is creamier when it's put in stuff than taro is. Taro is naturally sweeter. Ube is a creamier one. When you have the ube ice cream in Halo Halo, that's probably one I couldn't get rid of either. Is if we're talking specific foods, Halo Halo as a dessert.
Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us. It was great having you.
Of course. Thank you so much.
Here are our takeaways for this week's episode. Number 1, growing up in the only Asian family in town can make it hard to connect with one's culture when we have no one to compare notes with. It becomes hard to know what's a family quirk versus a cultural thing. Number 2, negative comments about accents add pressure on immigrants and their kids to assimilate. When people commented on their parents' accents, both Ari and Charlene were embarrassed, thinking that there was something wrong with their parents. So they tried to sound more white and do what the white kids do, which sometimes meant distancing themselves from their Asian culture in order to fit in. Number 3, careless words can have lasting impacts. The people making these offhand comments often don't think they said anything hurtful and soon forget about it, but their words have lasting impacts on the people receiving them. Number 4, While it might be hard to understand someone with an accent, it's worth remembering that they are speaking in a language other than their mother tongue, and we should appreciate their ability and willingness to do so for our benefit since we don't speak their language. Number 5, simply being around people who look different can make you self-conscious even if no one ever body shames you. In ballet, for example, the costume sizes being unrealistically small or the curvy dancers being placed in the back enforce a culture of valuing thinness without anybody having to say so. Number 6, if you don't know how to pronounce someone's name, ask them how to pronounce it and then give it a shot. People will appreciate you trying rather than giving up and saying, "Oh, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that." Because that makes them feel like they don't belong and that they are an inconvenience to you. And finally, you are Asian enough. Even if you don't speak the language, even if you haven't spent time in the country where your ancestors came from, you are Asian enough. That's it for today. We hope you'll tune in next week for another nuanced conversation.